G'day, it's Chris Johnson here. I am the programmer and game designer on Expand, and I thought I'd put together a bit of a video to show you how to use the level editor to create levels. Before I begin, I should say that this level editor is actually included with the game. We've included it in the Linux and the Linux and Windows versions of the game. So if you browse into the directory where the game contents, where you can see the game contents, what you'll find is on Windows you'll find two executables: the expand.exe executable and editor.exe. If you load the editor, then you'll get a screen like this. On Linux, you'll see two scripts: run expand and run editor. If you run the run editor command via the command line, then you'll get this up as well. The editor itself is actually fully functional and working on the Mac as well, but we haven't distributed it with the game yet. And the reason for that is we haven't yet sort of spent the time to go through and learn how through Xcode and on the Mac to create two app bundles and have those app bundles reference the same shared pool of data. I mean, in theory, we know how it works and we can hack together a solution, but we want to do something that works with the Apple way of doing things, and that takes a little bit of time to learn. But if there's interest in getting it to Apple, then getting it running on Mac, then let us know on the Expand community forums or on Twitter, and what we can do is we can work towards getting that set up. At the moment, if we created two app bundles, it would mean we have to duplicate all the files, and that would take extra time to download. And we didn't want to burden the average player with that extra download cost. So, I should also say that the editor is kind of in a soft beta state. There are still a whole bunch of bugs and issues with it, and I'll try to point those out as we go through the video. But it's only just ready for public consumption. We thought that there might be a few people who are really keen to check out and to understand how we make levels and to possibly build their own. And so we thought we'd include it with the game, as we promised on our website. So that's why you have it here. But just be aware that this has got a lot of bugs, and if there's a lot of interest in updating this and making this much better, then please let us know and we can work towards that. Okay, so when you load the editor, you get a screen like this. And what you'll find across the top is you've got several buttons to pause and resume the game and to mark checkpoints. So by default, we've loaded the main menu here. If I hit resume, what will happen is the game will run, and I can move my square around. Now, this is the main menu, and what happens in the actual Expand game is that we have a little screen that flashes up to say to use a controller and to wear headphones. But what actually happens is we already load you into the first level and then just put that screen in over the top. So that's why there's a little bit of a delay there. I'll quickly just stop this music and explain how to do that a bit later. So yeah, so in the editor, I can move around freely and edit the levels live. There's no sort of distinct phases between editing and playing. It's the same thing together. I can also go through and mark a checkpoint. So for example, if I will move down here. Oh, started another music cue. Maybe I'll mark this as a checkpoint. Then if I move over here and I hit return to last checkpoint, it jumps me back here, where I had previously marked the checkpoint. So it's pretty straightforward. I've got a list of levels on the left-hand side. So if we start from the top level folder, you can see Final. That contains a whole bunch of all the levels that we use in the final game. You can modify these, and these will make changes to the levels in the actual game. So just be aware of that. Feel free to look at these levels. If you want to change them and cheat through the game, we can't stop you. And that's also one of the reasons why we didn't put achievements into the game as well. Beyond the fact that achievements are kind of, aren't something that we like as game designers. There are also a few other examples here, some work in progress levels that you can dig through. Levels that contain all the background that we use on the website, some basic tests, some levels that were old, some levels from Hamish, who was a level designer that looked and played with the editor for about 3 or 4 days. And then some art examples, which is just me mucking around with stuff. So I'm going to jump into Final. I'm going to jump into World 1, which is Peril, and I'm going to load the second level. And I'll just stop this queue as well. Okay. So what we can see here is you can, just drop down, choose a level, load the level. If you have any changes, just save or hit Save As to save in a different directory. If you want to create new directories when you save, just put a slash at the very end here. Otherwise, just write the name. So maybe test or something, and that would save test, a level called test in that directory. Okay. We did have a feature where you could generate levels randomly. That's been disabled because it's not finished. It's something we probably won't get back to. By default, you're in this mode where you have a selector. So you can click and drag around and select things. And if I click on something like this, the black here, you can see a wall. And a wall is the basic sort of collision unit in the game. And every sort of entity, when you select it, will have a little properties panel. It says name. In this case, it says its current state. You can make it selectable in the editor or not. And there's a few other different options here too. You'll also see a timeline, which I'll go through and explain just in a GIF. So there's a few different things here. I've got these red walls, which are treated as triggers. So whenever you run into them, you die. And you've got these other blue things here, which only are visible in the editor. They're invisible triggers that just trigger off new events. You'll also notice on the side here, I can go through and add triggers, displacement entities, and text. So I'll jump back to this wall here, and I want to show you the timeline here. So every entity in Expand has its own timeline. In fact, it has what we call layered timelines. So for example, I might jump out, which I might just create a new test level here. And it starts off as blank. I'm going to drag out a wall. And with the wall, I can sort of go through and I can tweak the size of that, the start angle, the end angle, start and end. So this, yep. And these are, I should say the start and the end angle are relative to the 0, which is pointing to the east. And what you notice is as I go through and I stretch this in and change the values of this, I'm modifying the timeline. So for the default timeline at the instance or the point in time at 0, these values are being updated. Cool. And so one of the things I might do is if I click a plus under instance here, that's going to go through and create another, I suppose, frame at 1 second or another state. So if I go through here and I drag this around, then what you'll see is on the 0 instance, at 0 seconds it'll be there, and at 1 second it'll be here. If I save, if I save and run, sorry about that. I was still had this when I hit load, it loaded whatever was set in here. But yeah, so anyway, when I run that, you can see that it just does that animation. And in fact, I can come into here, and I can go rerun to run it again. Okay. What I could also do is I could also make it loop. So after 1 second, I can make it loop, and then we get something like this. If I go back to the 0 state, time at 0, sorry, and I hit plus, it'll create a new state at 2. That's just 1 second after the last state. And it mirrors what was in the state when I hit plus. So now, if I make it loop at 2, you can see it bounces back and forth like this. And that's great. And this is, fully interactable. This is a real collision in the world. I can, if I put, multiple walls here, I can really get squashed. So yeah, and what we could also do is we could say when the game, once you loop, maybe loop to a certain point. So in this case, it's got to loop to once it gets to the end, it's going to loop to 1. So it'll go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, and then 2, it'll loop back to 1. And this is useful if you want to do like a lead-in animation. So I'll remove that. Oh, and you can add a small delay to the start. So, so if I load the level again, 1 and 2, then it moves and bounces. Okay. Now, what I can do is I can also go through and add easing, like you would with any other animation kind of program. So maybe I'll do sign in and out. And what happens is I'm applying this to the first instant. That means as we're transitioning from 0 to 1, it's going to use this easing. That also means that the easing to property on these at time 0 is not important. It's not really used. The editor should really blank that out. So now we get a nice sort of sign in out animation. Okay, now that's cool. I'll save that. And what I'll do is I'll actually create a new layer on this timeline to show something else. I'll call this in out. And so this is going to start from here. And I'm going to make this one move in and out. Okay. Now at the moment we're still on the default layer, but we've got this in and out animation. It's going to loop, where are we? Loop after 2 seconds. Oh, I should say if I say loop after say 2.5, anything out of the bounds, it never reaches 2.5, so it'll never loop. So it has to loop at 2, or anything less than 2. Now in order to change the timeline here, I need to use a trigger to trigger off an event. So I'm going to click here and go add trigger. And by default, triggers come out as gray. If I hit is invisible, then the trigger will be invisible. In this case, it's the editor, so it's showing it in this blue style. And what I can do inside the trigger, I can modify several other properties. So I can say the field color, in this case, it's invisible, so the field color doesn't matter. If it's masked or not, I'll come back to that after. But essentially, you can mask out triggers using folds. Is it selectable? And then what we do is we have with the trigger, we have 2 types of events. Events that are triggered when you move onto the trigger, and those that are triggered when you move off the trigger. And you can choose whether you want to trigger these events only once, the first time you either move onto or off of the trigger, or multiple times. And you can adjust them independently. So I'm going to go here to allow multiple, enter and exit events. And then when we enter, if I come across here, what we can do is I can hit plus to add events. So these are all the different events that are inside the expand editor. And we use all of these events inside the game, or pretty much all of them, I think. The most common one that you'll use is the modify entity timeline, so I'm going to just add that. And then what happens is we can choose the entity we want to modify. So in this case, I want to modify a wall 0, which turns out to be that one, which I could rename. So if I maybe my wall, if I go into here, I can see it's updated. Yeah, and so I want to modify the timeline here, and maybe I want to move it from whatever state it is currently into in out. And I want this I can say how long I want this transition to go over. It's going to modify. It's going to transition to the 0th zero time in this in out timeline. Now, if all that works, and I walk over here, it takes 1 second, and now it's in and out. What I might also do is I might add an event for when you exit to make it go back the other way. Default, yep. And it goes back. And there. And then back. Woo. And this is all going to be dependent on these modification events are being triggered when I'm either on the trigger, so right now, or when I move off. Okay. Now I'm going to remove that event by just clicking the minus and the minus as well. I can also remove entire layers too. So I'm going to just remove all the animation that we have here. And I'm going to go through and explain a different type of entity that we have. This is called a displacement entity. And this is the kind of entity we use to modify something based on the player's movement. And this comes up as purple. It's invisible inside the game. And if I select and drag it out, you notice that I can choose here. I can view a timeline, so these displacement entities have their own timeline. But I can also describe the shifts that occur depending on how the player has moved through this entity. So here, what I can do is I can just add a radial shift. And the best way to highlight this is just to show you through an example. So what I'm doing here is I've added a shift, and that's a radial shift, and that's going to look at how much the player has moved radially through this entity. And then based on the percentage that it's traveled through there, it's going to modify the end angle. And it's going to modify it by 20. So if we go through here, what you can see is, as I move through here, the end angle on the wall on this side is changing. And once I move all the way through, it's modified by 20 units. If I move all the way back, it's modified, it removes 20 units. And yeah, now I can also use this same kind of idea rotationally. So I could say, depending on how far I've rotated through the object, it'll modify the end angle too. So we can see here that as I move through this, it's modifying the end angle. And I can either shift by a certain amount, or I could always shift to a certain amount as well. And that's useful if you want to force the value of something to be, certain value, as opposed to just saying increases by 10. And there is, so for example here, if I do shift by 20, if I go around like this, if I go through it and then I go back, it's going to shift by 20 again. If I do shift 2 though, it's only going to shift it by 20 once. Now I think in all the levels for Expand, we actually don't make this distinction at all, because we funnel you so you can only move through these displacement entities in one way. But you could add additional puzzles and challenges using that idea. Now we can also do things like we can make the displacement entity modify itself. We can modify the trigger, and essentially this hooks into any properties of these. So the rotation, the starting angle, the ending angle, the inner radius and the outer radius, everything's up for grabs. And where we use this the most is we use this to modify the world camera. So for example here, I can say, depending on how far I've moved through, radially I've moved through this, I'm going to shift the entire world in and out. So let's have a look at that in practice. Maybe I'll switch it over to be radial, and we'll do something like this, 80. Oh, so in this case, as I move through it, everything is being pushed out, including the player. But you're probably used to seeing it like this, where it's -80, so everything shrinks in. Right. And if you have more complicated levels, this effect gets much more interesting. The other thing that I can do is I can select a whole bunch of these different entities. I can right click and I can group as an entity group. And I can also copy and paste different entity groups as well. Just be aware that if I copy and paste a displacement entity or a trigger, then the displacement options for what you're shifting and the events that you have on the trigger aren't copied over, except for on triggers like the very basic events. So if you copy a death trigger, it'll make sure that you die when you run into the wall still. Or if you have a save checkpoint event, it'll also copy that one. But if you're modifying an existing entity's timeline and you have that event applied to a trigger and you copy that trigger, and that event won't be copied over. What you'll also notice is if I create a death trigger, it'll create a trigger that's red and that has the death event applied, and everything else grayed out. Okay, the other options that I haven't looked at yet is text. The other options that I haven't looked at yet is text. So all the text that we have is defined in a language file that you can see in data/conf/lang, and all these strings are listed here. And so when you select a bit of text, you just go into here, you choose the string, and yeah. So feel free to add additional strings to the bottom of our language list. The file is in XML. The formatting is pretty straightforward. It supports Unicode. Yeah. So you go here, you can describe this entity, give it a name. You can select if it inverts on the background. So if it does this, black on white, white on black, that kind of thing. You can even see it here in this outline. Anyway, yeah, you can select the color of the text, and then through the timeline, you can modify things like the you can modify different properties as well. Just go through and modify the rotation, the scale, the radius. For some reason, not transparency. I don't know what's going wrong there. Usually, you can modify that. Maybe if I switch to a different. Interesting. Okay. Like I said, this is still in kind of beta, so I don't know why that's blocking it out. Yeah. And then one of the good things about the expand editor is that it'll automatically flip the text the right way up when it loads. When it loads the level, or when you die and the world rotates around. So if something starts at the top and you die at the bottom and it rotates the screen by 180, the text will automatically fade out from being this way up to being upside down, which looks right way up when you rotate 180 degrees. So this also has animation that you can apply. Nothing really amazing here. You can choose the different fonts that you want to make use of. In order to actually see these, you need to change the game language. Yeah. Now, each of the text is also the text itself is positioned independently depending on the language that you're using, and the font that you choose to use is also dependent on the language that you're currently in. So all this timeline data and font data is dependent on your current language. I won't add much more to that besides going through and looking at folds. So folds are a little bit of a weird kind of entity in Expand. They're like, firstly, they are used to mask out space, but they're also used to bound space as well. So what you see here is you see a fold, and that fold has been chosen to mask out the background, right? And so it just is cutting out that space there. And as a player, I can go through and jump in here. And that's really, really cool. But the other thing is the fold is also a group. Okay, so you might remember before, we could select a few things and group as an entity group. Now, it turns out that when you group something together, you can modify the rotation of everything in the group and the radial offset of everything in the group as well. Which means, since folds are an extension upon groups, you can do the same here. So a fold has two timelines, one that describes the bounds of the mask, and one that describes the sort of camera. Now, in order to jump into this group, you can just hit the jump into button, and you can add things inside here. So I might add, a few different bits and pieces. Maybe I'll add like a fold. And what you'll see is, you'll see that the fold is keeping a bounds on how big this item can be. So this wall here is bigger than the bounds of the fold, but since it's inside the fold, it has to stay within those bounds. There's an option if I go to the right hand side, if I go to editor options, if you unticked will bound fold drawing, then what you can see is you can see everything without the bounds being applied. But that only is the case when you're inside a fold. So if I jump out now, it's bound to the space. Okay, now we use the sort of bounding technique in some other levels later in the game. So if I go to, where are we? World 3, Level 1. What you can see here is that there's, I'll stop this again. But yeah, in this level, everything is inside of one giant fold. And that fold, essentially that fold exists, if we look at the bounds, it exists between -255 and 105. If I make the interrelative coordinates, it's 360 degrees. The span is 360 degrees. And so when we're bounding space, we can bound that to different angles. So for example, if I bound between 0 and 360, that's different. That's a different bounding range from -360 to 0. So in these levels, what we've done is we've actually bounded the space between 0 and 360, and then we use a displacement entity to peel back that bounding range. So for example, as we move through, maybe as we move by 10 units around the circle, the bounding range is between 10 and 370 instead. Alright. I think that's the basics behind the editor. I should say that a few more minor details, which is that everything in the game is inside a group, and that group is called the root group, and that's thought of as the world camera. On the right hand side, maybe I'll jump back to my level. Oh, where did my thing go? Oh, I forgot to save, but yeah, before I switched level, I forgot to save my my fold and my other changes, so I'm only seeing a few things here. I thought I'd save my wall, but maybe not. Yeah, anyway, maybe I'll drop one back in. So another thing you can do is if you've got a scroll wheel, you can scroll to move the world in and out. You can see those changes up at the top. Sorry. And if you hold control, you can scroll readily around. If you've died several times, you can reset the offset from death, or just reset the entire death camera, which is what I've just done. There are several options that I've included here in the editor options. So these are whether to show things that are invisible. You can flag entities as non-collidable. So if they're not collidable, they'll come up in pink. That's more of an optimization thing. That's not super important. You can go through and see the collision bodies. So maybe if I do here, you can see which objects the game is currently considering as collidables. As I mentioned before, you can bound the fold the drawing of the bounds of the folds. This is, of course, only in the editor. You can show a grid, and you can also snap things to the grid to keep things nice and aligned. I found that I didn't really use the grid too much. I just sort of would sketch something out and then round out the numbers by editing the panels, editing the text fields at the bottom. There's also, I'll jump down to this field, this sidebar, which is Fmod properties. So we use Fmod Designer for the music in Expand and handling the transitions. And in Fmod Designer, you have things like music events and cues, and also variables that we use to tweak and to modify things as well. At the moment, we don't have event parameters supported in the editor, but they are supported in the game. So through Lua scripting and stuff, which I'll come back to. But you can begin and end any of the different music cues as well. Just be aware that the cues are made with certain transitions in mind. So you can get different things playing on top of each other that aren't meant to be if you're not careful. Okay, there's also, you can also go through and modify the save data of the game. These are just stored in plain text XML files that are stored in data/saves. You can name your levels. There's a level title. That's meant to say author. I don't know where that's disappeared to. And description. you can specify the start points. So as you noticed in the open world of the game, different levels can have multiple start points, and those start points can have events. And you can also choose to load the game at different entrances and specify where exactly you want the player to be when they load the game from that entrance. Okay, level details, start point, level scripts. So the game is entirely scriptable inside of Lua, and through this panel you can create blank scripts or empty stub scripts that have all the basic functions that you need. So if I go maybe main.lua, create a stub file, add it, then I can go and modify that in my scripting environment. Any changes made to the script are only going to be reflected when you reload a level. There's some built-in library scripts that I've added as well. I can put up documentation explaining what is exposed from inside of Lua if people are interested. But maybe just the best way to get a sense for it is to have a poke around the existing Lua scripts. You can see a full listing of the structures in the level here, and these and the listing here is going to be dependent upon the scope that you're in. So if you're inside a group, it'll only show things inside that group in the structures menu. Fold layers. What happens is, since folds do masking, you might want to preference which fold is drawn first, so you can modify the order in which they're drawn here. And game strings. So this is a listing of all the strings in the game. You can modify them if in English. Unfortunately, the GUI system we're using is not playing very nice with the different with Unicode. So yeah. So this should work. It hasn't been heavily tested because it doesn't support other languages. And I think that's all the basic details that you need to know to start making levels. A few things to point out, just some general tips, is that you need to make sure that in your levels you provide enough room for the player to move through gaps. If the player can't fit through a gap, we generate a small V body, which is a body that sits between the gaps so the player can't push down into them. You can also link levels together. So we have these events called load level events. And I think I've almost covered everything. Oh, you can also, if you modify the game into a certain state, then you can go through and you can generate, if you have no events selected in the event panel, you can generate all the events to get the game into its existing state. So generate here, and what this will do is it will generate a whole bunch of events to force the world into the existing state that you're in right now. Some things that you'll want to be careful of. Firstly, the game isn't entirely aware of when you're using the scroll wheel, and when you're using the scroll wheel and when you're over a text field. So, for example, here I've clicked in here and I'm scrolling the wheel, so it's not scrolling the world. But if I deselect this, this is not entirely consistent. But yeah, sometimes you'll find that when you scroll in and out over a list box like this, it still scrolls the world. It's an annoying kind of bug. The other thing is you want to make sure, like sometimes you'll find that you're trying to move the player around and they're not moving. That can usually be caused by being inside of a text field like this one. So just make sure you click away from that. Yeah. I think that's everything. If I'm missing anything, feel free to ask questions on the forum. I hope people hope people have a chance to dig around and to see how all the levels are made with Expand. The best way to get a sense for how things work is to load up the existing level sets. Before I forget, the other thing I should add is that you can also trigger events onto the beat. So here, if you hit beat, you can say that you want an event to trigger on the next beat, on the next bar, when the next music segment starts, and so on. And we use that a lot in the game to make the game feel kind of tied to the music. I think that's everything. There's a lot of different things here. Yeah, that looks like it's about right. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for tuning in. Yeah, like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to post them on our community forums. I'm monitoring them every day, so I'll try to jump on them. And if you're really keen, feel free to post up your levels in the forum. That would be really awesome. And if there's enough levels, and they're really, really good, and we can link them together, I might talk to Chris about doing some extra music for the game, and maybe we can do a community pack. Cool, awesome, thanks so much, and have a great day. I'll catch you later.